What do I need to be good at to be great at something?
Hello, everyone. You are listening to She Leads with Carly. And in this show, we talk to the absolute best, brightest, and yes, badass leaders.
Tap into where your natural curiosity takes you. Just making sure you're not your own roadblock. Even if you do fall, you're going to fall and you're going to learn.
Together, let's build a DNA of what it takes to rise to the top and truly make an impact. I'm your host, Carly Malatsky. Hello, everyone. I am super excited to welcome our guest today, Becky Sauerbrunn. Becky is one of the greatest defenders in U.S. women's national team history. With 216 caps to her name, Becky has won 2 World Cups and an Olympic gold medal. Not only that, she serves as the U.S. women's national team captain and is the first ever president of the U.S. Women's National Team Players Association, where she has fought for equal pay for the women's side. Going beyond her contributions to the national squad, Becky's dominance as a central defender is evident through her 4-time recognition as the NWSL Defender of the Year and her leadership in securing 3 NWSL championships, one of which she led the Portland Thorns to win last year, in which she currently plays for, the team in which she currently plays for right now. It becomes quite clear for anyone who watches Becky play over the years, she's truly one of the best center backs to ever play the game. Becky, welcome to the show. It is such an honor to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's quite the intro. I really appreciate it.
Of course. So Becky, actually first set the scene. Where are you in the world? How are you doing? I know you guys just came off a win last night against NC Courage. So tell me a little bit about you.
Yeah, I am currently in Portland, Oregon. I'm in the northeast side of the town and just moved here kind of like a few years ago and just have absolutely fallen in love with Portland and Oregon because I've lived everywhere. Soccer has taken me everywhere, but this is very easily my favorite city. And yeah, in the middle of a professional season right now, we had an amazing game last night. We actually got a red card 18 minutes into the first half and still wound up winning the game, even going a goal down. So pretty awesome game last night.
And that's, by the way, I read a stat. That's the first time it's ever happened, going down a player first half and coming out with a win. That's amazing.
It is amazing. And it's very, very unheard of because it is very hard to do.
Yeah. So Becky, as you know, what I love to do in this podcast is start off with your childhood. But before we get to that, obviously we just came off the World Cup. The Women's World Cup is done. Spain are now the national champion, or the world champions, my bad. And I want to know, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on Spain being the winners? And even more so, we all know about, give us some context about the Spanish Federation and the coach. There's some strife amongst the players. And yet, even with all of this conflict, they still came out with a win. How do you conceptualize all of this?
Yeah, that's really tough for me because I really like the Spanish players and how they play. Obviously, they play beautiful soccer. It's very conflicting for me that they won in just that, the fight that they've been having with their federation as far as like creating a healthy work environment, and also some complaints about their head coach, who the federation then backed them. No, even though 15 players wrote a very, I would say like important, vulnerable letter where they're asking for change or they won't be invited or they won't go back in. And then they have the federation say, no, we're going to back the same coach. And also you need to publicly apologize. Like, it's just so patronizing. And, you know, some of the players decided to do that. And then some decided that they weren't going to, and they missed out on this World Cup. And so to think of those players watching their team win, you know, I'm sure there's a lot of conflicting feelings there. But I will say that as players, as a player that, you know, has had something to galvanize us, whether it's fighting for equal pay or in the Spanish players' cases, maybe in spite of their coach and their federation, like something like that galvanizing you is very powerful. And I think the Spanish players really rode that momentum.
Yeah. And is that what you almost attribute it to? Because afterwards, you see there's a lot of content where even, you know, they're bypassing the coach's hug or high five. And so it's almost like because they have a common goal or maybe a common enemy, that's what really drove that success too.
I would say that's really powerful. And I know from the times that we have won major tournaments, we've always had that something, whether it's like a tagline or maybe it's something like social justice. Like there's something that's really just bringing everyone together. And it is really powerful. I cannot, overemphasize that enough.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to come back to this, and specifically the women's, how you kind of conceptualize the U.S. women's national team coming out of the round of 16. But before that, Becky, I want to know about you as a 5-year-old. Who were you as a kid? What did you want to be when you grew up? And tell me a little bit about that time.
Oh man, 5-year-old Becky growing up in St. Louis County. And that's when like my parents first kind of just threw me into sports. There was this great thing with our town. We had this Olivet Athletic Association, OAA, and you could play all these different sports. And like the coaches were always just someone's mom or dad who like maybe played in their day and just wanted to be involved with their kids. And it was so fun. I dabbled in all these different sports. And, I was playing with all my school friends. So it was just so much fun and such a great introduction to the sport in general. And I've always been, more introverted, a little bit more quiet. And so to have sports be kind of that outlet where you just kind of have this like made family and made community. And it just put me at ease and at comfort. And so what I wanted to be, when I was super young was either a veterinarian, like just for cats. I don't know if you can just specify, but that's what I wanted to be, or a radio DJ host.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. I was never expecting that. Were you experimenting with DJing at that young age too, or you just saw a video? What spurred that?
I don't know. I mean, I've always really loved country music, and I think that's an influence from my family. And so just like listening to the radio on those like car trips, I think really resonated with me. And I would just kind of use boxes at the house and kind of like steal a cat toy from one of my cats, those like springy ones that have the pom-pom on the top. It would be my microphone. And I just set up like a little DJ station. So, I mean, I was pretty serious about it at 5.
I love that. And I know you've been pretty vocal about this, but you have 2 older brothers. And I may have either read this or heard on a podcast, but at one point they even wanted to see how far they can throw you off the couch. Is that true? Or tell me a little bit about that dynamic and how they've influenced you today.
Oh, yeah. 2 older brothers, 8 years and 4 years older than me, Grant and Adam. And so like significantly older, growing up. And I just became kind of like the guinea pig, like the person that if they were bored, they were just going to mess with. And so, a lot of household shenanigans. There are times when, they were playing roller hockey out in the driveway and they wanted me to be goalkeeper. So they're shoving like couch cushions into my shirt and strapping on, a piece of plywood onto my arm with duct tape so I could be the goalkeeper and kind of like try to save my life from their slap shots. But I definitely, they made me learn very early on how to be very strategic in getting out of things and doing like conflict resolution, but also just kind of like, okay, I need to go through this. Let's grit and bear it, and let's get through this.
And so what brought you to the sport of soccer? When did you start soccer, and how what got you exposed to it? And also, for how long were you playing other sports as well?
So it started at 5 when I started doing soccer at the local park. Like my mom and dad would just walk me down. It was right across from my elementary school. And so like all my school friends were doing it. And I loved playing all the sports, but soccer from very early on just became my favorite. And we enjoyed playing together so much. They're very short little seasons during the summer that we actually wanted to do indoor soccer, which is really big in St. Louis. And so that same OAA team became an indoor team. And so we stayed together for a bunch of years. And I mean, I'm still in touch with some of those guys even now, because it was mostly made up of guys. I had 1 or 2 girls with me. But it was something that, very formative years getting to play with these people and just having so much fun doing it. And I played basketball, volleyball, and soccer throughout high school. I even considered trying out for the basketball team at UVA, but my soccer coach was like, it overlaps a little bit. Like that's a little too much. So we're going to just ask you to do soccer. And I was like, all right, you are paying for my tuition, so I will listen to you.
So, wow, that's incredible actually to have that option. But even before in high school, that was when you actually first got into the youth national team system. You went into the U15, U16s, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so at this time, were you still how were you viewing soccer? Was it still just a hobby that, maybe you're good at? Or did you start thinking like, okay, this is something I want to do for the next 20 years? How were you thinking of it from a future perspective?
There was a point when I was 14 watching the 1999 Women's World Cup where it clicked for me. And I remember very, very distinctly watching the final with my dad in St. Louis and watching the women win and just seeing their, like, the joy on their faces and them celebrating. And it was such an amazing game. And there's so many people watching and like something clicking in my brain being like, I really want to know what that feels like to work towards something like that and to be able to celebrate it with, you know, people that you love. And so from then on, to me, soccer was still something I loved, but I also kind of was like, okay, my moonshot is the women's national team. And then like my parents kind of figuring out, okay, what's like possible pathways? Because they didn't know how to deal with a child that was so into this one thing and really wanted to take it as far as I could take it. And so they really helped. They're like, okay, we got to get you into your state ODP team. And then from there, you know, maybe you make the regional team. And there was no pressure, but they kind of helped me see that there was a pathway. And I'm so thankful to them for, you know, kind of taking the time to like call people. I remember them calling my club coaches and just asking these questions about what are the possibilities? What are the avenues? And luckily there were a few, not many back in that time, but there were some.
And then you ultimately decided to play for the University of Virginia under Steve Swanson as a coach. And you knew Steve a little bit before from the youth system. So walk me through that decision to go play for UVA and also under Steve, if that came into it as well.
Oh, very much so. So, you know, for whatever reason on the women's side, we get recruited so outrageously early, like even before you can officially take a visit, you know, people are already committing. And so I remember it was like junior year and I was kind of like not quite sure the first day that, you know, colleges could send like, hey, we're interested in you. Maybe we want to come take an unofficial visit. Steve sent a letter that first day, opened it. There was this beautiful handwritten letter and was just like, hey, we really want you at UVA. Like, please consider taking a visit here. And Steve is to this day, like one of the best coaches I've ever had. He's a friend, he's a mentor. And so, you know, I was like, I definitely want to put Virginia on the list of possibilities. And then I also had Notre Dame. So those two were like my big two that I took unofficial visits, met the coaches, met the team. And when I stepped foot on UVA campus, I was like, this is it. And then just seeing Klockner Stadium, which is just this beautiful stadium, and getting to meet the team and like hanging out with Steve. And I think Steve is just amazing. And so it's pretty easy decision, especially when you look at the academics of it too. I mean, it's a pretty great public school.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's also beautiful, just the environment and the history behind it. It's a stunning campus.
It is.
So Becky, I'm curious, we've seen the landscape start to change with the women's side, where now you have these young girls who are actually forgoing their college experience and going straight to pro. And I think it's becoming more and more common. And not only that, we're actually seeing them quite successful. And, you know, Alyssa Thompson, perfect example, played in the World Cup, 18-year-old, just powerhouse. I'm curious, how do you think about all of this and whether this is an exciting part for the women's game or, you know, there is that piece of college that is actually incredibly valuable that they should go through?
I think it's so completely an individual decision. I think I love that I went to college. I think I needed to get that like socialization. I think I wanted to be out on my own, but still have some sort of structure. And also like soccer at that point, there weren't that many possibilities for me just to forego and to play professionally. Like I'd have to travel overseas. And I wasn't quite sure I wanted to do that. And so like the people that I've spoken to that have foregone college, they do not regret their decision. They are very happy. They either school wasn't for them or they just love soccer so much that they wanted to take that next step. And so I think that's a conversation that, you know, you need to have with yourself and with your support systems. But yeah, I think it's just so individual. Yeah.
And so while you were at Virginia, was there, like you said, it was a different time in where, you know, there weren't all of these opportunities and there wasn't a ton of pro leagues out there. How were you thinking of, you know, post UVA and whether soccer was just an absolute certainty versus, you know what, maybe I should consider my career long-term?
So going into my senior season, I actually was very sad because I was thinking like, this is very easily the last competitive year of soccer I'm ever going to play it. And Steve even noticed it in preseason. He's just like, what's going on with you? You just kind of seem like sad and anxious. And so I told him, I'm just like, this could be my last year. There had been a professional league, the WSA, that already folded. The WPS hadn't started yet. So I was like, would I go overseas? Like, I didn't even really know that much about it. It was still kind of semi-professional. So like, how would I live? How would I make money?
Right.
And so I was like, okay, like, I need to have a plan B. And so I was actually in a master's program for education at UVA. And so I was like, okay, like I'll do my student teaching. I'll get my teaching certificate. I'll have that. But even going through the master's program, I was like, my heart is not in this. My mom was a American history teacher for middle school her entire career. And I was like, okay, maybe this is like, I'm supposed to be a teacher. Maybe this is like a legacy thing. And it just did not click with me. I loved, making lesson plans, but I was such a poor class manager. I was like, let the kids do whatever they wanted, which I guess you're not supposed to do. So I just knew it was a plan B. And so I was like, all right, I got to figure out a way to make soccer happen for me. And luckily, by the time I had graduated, the NWSL was the WPS was just starting.
So that's a bit surprising, right? Given that you played for the U20 Women's World Cup in your sophomore season. So you already knew that, you're at that level. You can play with these girls on a national level. And yet senior year, you were still, expecting even to forego soccer competitively, which is, it sounds crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, it was crazy. It was either, so, you age out of the youth system and then the next step is just the senior team. And so I wasn't getting any calls up. I wasn't getting any camps. And so I'm like, oh gosh, maybe I'm like, getting phased out of the system. Like I'm just not at that level. I will never be at that level. And, miraculously, when my eligibility ended, I got my first call up to the national team. It was like, it's like the universe knew that I needed some sort of like push to keep me going. And so I got a call in and I went to my first national team cap. It was under Pia Sundaga and I only made it. I got 2 caps. And then she was like, I'm sorry, like you're just not quite ready. But luckily I had the WPS to fall back on so that I was playing competitively week in and week out. And I could really just get my game to where it needed to be to hopefully get another call in. But that took 2.5 years. I was like, I don't know if I'm ever going to get another call.
Okay, wait, let's unpack that a little bit where, first of all, I would love to hear that story of getting your first cap because I've heard that it's, a cool story in which you were going into the movie theater maybe, but tell me a little bit about that story of, I actually have a chance with the senior team.
I was in Arlington, Virginia. I was with my boyfriend and we were outside a movie theater where we were going to go see The Town. Like I remember that very distinctly. And I was checking my phone to see if I needed to respond to anything before, not being disconnected for like 3 hours. And I see this like odd phone number and a message. And I'm like, okay, I guess I'll listen to this. And it's Pia. And she's like super Swedish. And so heavy accent. She's just like, hey, Becky, it's Pia. There's been an injury in camp because they were in a pre-qualification tournament camp for the World Cup in 2011. And she's like, hey, so yeah, there's an injury and we want you to come in tomorrow. And, I was like, okay, I got to call her back. She picked up, but then she turned the phone over to the to kind of the GM, the team coordinator, who's just like, yeah, we have this flight for you. Make sure you have all your stuff and we'll see you the next day. And I was like, Zola, we can't see this movie right now. I'm so sorry. We gotta like go find all my stuff and just prepare for me to leave.
And this was at the Four Nations tournament in China, correct?
That was my first cap, was in China. My first 2 caps were in China. And then, so when I got my call from Pia, that was the second time. That was after the 2.5 years in the wilderness.
Oh, okay. So let me go back now to 2008, before the 2-year gap.
Okay.
You got your first cap. Take me through that time where mentally it is so challenging to not know where you stand, or not only that, think that you're not good enough. So how did you deal with that going into a camp saying, you know what, I have to prove myself and prove to them that I deserve to be here? How do you deal with that mentally? If there are any like personal tactics that you use?
So we're talking about the first time I went into a national team camp. So
Yes.
Nerves are all over the place. You obviously want to make a really good first impression. For me, it was remembering like I got invited into this camp for a reason. Like I was doing something right when I was playing collegiately that they liked. And so if anything, like be true to myself, play my game. If they saw something in you, they probably want to see it more. And so I was like, don't try to change myself. Don't try to become like all the other center backs that are here. Like my style, like my profile as a center back, like I'm more short range passer. I like to use other people to get out of pressure. At the time, a lot of the center backs were more like longer range, hitting long diagonals to break pressure. And I was like, okay, maybe they just want a different profile of player. And I think she really did appreciate that about me. I think there were also gaps in my game that it became clear at camp that I wasn't quite ready to be there day in and day out. Like there were holes in my game that I really needed to work on. But I do think I left a good enough impression that I kind of stayed on her radar. Because then, 2.5 years later, after I've worked really hard on those things she told me I needed to work on, I did get that call back.
And Becky, in that first cap and that first camp, like you said, you know what you're good at and you stood true to that. Would you say that game IQ was also there then? Like you knew this is my strength, these are my gaps, I'm recognizing that, and let me stick to that? Or was that something you actually developed over the years?
I would say that under my time with Steve, I know that physically, like not the fastest, not the strongest, but that I did have a pretty good brain for the game. And so he really fostered that. That was the first time I really started watching film. There wasn't a lot of film on women's teams. And so he would have clips of the Italian men's back line. So like Maldini, Cannavaro, and he would watch these films with me and just point out like, look how this person leading this line is basically dictating to the other attack where they can go and where they can't go. And I was just like, this is amazing that a center back could have that much control over a game, because at that age, you're just kind of like, oh, a center back is usually just a center midfielder that wasn't good enough to stay in the center midfield. And so he really taught me like the subtleties and the nuances and the angles. And so I had a little bit of that going into my first camp, and then having that level jump so much higher. And all of a sudden you're competing against these women that have all this experience, that have seen so many things before, that are the fastest, are the strongest. I realized like, oh, I need, if I'm going to use my brain to kind of counteract these things, I need to get a lot smarter as well.
And then you mentioned it took 2.5 years to get that call from Pia leading up to the 2011 World Cup. Take me a little bit through those 2.5 years. Did you ever have a moment where you're like, you know what, this is too fucking hard. I maybe just need to hang up and, go another route?
I knew I wanted to keep playing soccer. I had tried to convince myself that just being a professional player and being the best professional player that I could be was going to be enough for me. But every time I would see Pia at one of our games and she wouldn't come say hi, or every time a camp roster went out and I wasn't on there, like my heart still hurt. So I just knew that it was still my moonshot. And then I was competing with a lot of those national team players day in and day out. So I knew I was getting to a place where I could hang with them and I could, compete with the best of them. And so when I finally got that call in, I knew that was still the universe telling me, like, don't give up.
Yeah. And like I love how you say it, casually now, right? Not getting your name on the roster, but in the moment, it's really freaking hard. And it's hard to see your work. And yet, you're not getting that results or that reward. How did you, from a, day-to-day deal with that of, you feel like you're putting in the work, but you're not getting that reward? Or, you see Pia in the stands of your game and yet she's not recognizing you as that final 18 or 23, whatever the number is. How did you really deal with that?
So I dealt with that with trying to change the way I was getting my confidence. And so instead of like turning towards all these external things like a call in or Pia saying hi to me after a game, it turned into, okay, what did I do this game? What have I done over these series of games? Am I getting better? Am I accomplishing the goals that I've been creating for myself? Because I do like setting goals, whether it's like short term or long term. So it's like, am I getting better? You're competing with some of the best players in the world. Are you learning from them? Are you getting to a point where you feel like you are competitive against them? So taking the little wins where I could. And yeah, you deal with the disappointment. But if anything, that just kind of drove me to be even like stronger and a little bit more on the knife's edge. And I realized that like when I'm a little bit pissed off, I probably play my best soccer. And I learned that during that time.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. And it's also a matter, I think it's a great, life lesson in general where you can't rely on someone else. And it's so easy as an athlete, right? You have a coach to give you that validity, but you can't rely on someone else to give you that confidence, and you have to find it within yourself. And I think like that's a perfect example of you doing that. So that's awesome. I love that. So Becky, walk me a little bit through 2011. You had this chance to now go to the World Cup. Walk me through that experience. What was going through your mind of going to your first World Cup?
Well, what's crazy is that when I got called in as an alternate, like literally Pia was like, look, we have no expectations. You're basically just a body here to help train the players that'll probably make the qualification roster and then ultimately the World Cup roster. Yeah. And I went in and I was like, oh, well, there are no expectations on me. I am free. And like the sense of freedom that I had to just play how I wanted to play, I actually got onto that qualification roster. Like I made that roster. And then from there, made the World Cup roster. And so like, it was kind of a wild, like no expectations. All of a sudden you're going to your first World Cup. And I did not have many caps under my name. I probably going into the World Cup had maybe 12 and no expectations for me to play. They were very happy with the center back pairing that they had. They made that very clear to me. I'm like, okay, great. I will, train as hard as I can, make sure that they are as prepared as they can be. And then one of the players got a red card in a game against Brazil. And even
Bueller
then, this is Rachel Bueller, now Rachel Van Hallebeck. And even at that point, I mean, that game was just wild. If you've never seen highlights from that game, I absolutely recommend going to see it. So we win in PKs and we're going to the semifinal against France. And I didn't even think that I was going to play. Like I thought they'd reconfigure the back line, maybe push an outside back in. And Pia told me, she's like, yeah, no, you're going to play. Like you're starting your first game at the World Cup is going to be a semifinal against France. And I was just like, oh my goodness. But I was so excited and of course so nervous because I was like, do not be the person that messes this up for the rest of the team, which is probably not a great mindset, but I really was like, don't ruin this for everybody else. Like, please. And it turned out great. We won that game 3-1. I had a pretty solid game, enough where they actually like considered playing me in the final. They decided not to. And unfortunately, we wound up losing to Japan in the final in PKs. But yeah, that was my first tournament experience, was a semifinal, 90 minutes.
Incredible.
Oh, it was awesome. It was so cool.
What did you learn from that experience of playing with freedom and, no expectations, but it ultimately benefited you, right, in the long run, and you performed very well? Has that translated to, nowadays and past that 2011 World Cup, and how so? Yeah.
Oh, very much so. Obviously as athletes, our form, like it comes and it goes, it dips, it rises. And for me, like when I'm trying to analyze why I'm not playing at my best, it's usually like I have this sense of responsibility and heaviness, and I'm like being a little bit more indecisive. I find myself a little bit more in no man's land. And so like getting away from that and being like, no, I always say to myself, be brave and assertive. And I feel like with bravery and assertiveness, that is freedom, right? To be who you want to be and just make a decision and go for it. And so that's something that I learned then. If I can find that feeling and nurture that feeling and get into that zone more often, I do play my best soccer.
Wow. I love that. That's awesome. And so after that 2011 World Cup, the following year were the Olympics. And from my understanding, you continue to be that almost substitute role, correct? So how was that expected going in? Was it almost like a similar wave you were riding from the World Cup? You'd be like, you know what, this is my role. This is okay. I'm in the system, so I feel good. Or how were you thinking through it?
So interestingly enough, after the World Cup, they were trying me at outside back. And I think they appreciated how I played, and they wanted to find a spot for me on the field. And so they're like, let's just try you at left back. And so I got a bunch of looks at left back. I was competing against like Kelly O'Hara for that same position. And Kelly was like clearly better than me at outside back. And so I just was not a starter going into 2012. I was kind of like a utility backline player. I could fill in wherever they needed me to. Right. And, disappointing, but like I got it. I still don't have that many caps. You're going into an Olympics that was like right around the corner from the World Cup. And so yeah, didn't play a whole lot. I got a couple minutes in the group stage. And then Rachel, again, in the semi against Canada, which was another wild game, I think she got a cramp. And so I wound up playing the second overtime period of an Olympic semifinal at Old Trafford. And the game was wild. We were playing Canada, and Christine Sinclair was just going off. She was having like the game of her life. So she would score and then we would score. She would score, we would score. And then finally we wound up winning that game and making it to the finals. And once again, I was considered maybe to be a starter for that final, but they didn't go that way, which is, fine. And then Rachel, I think, got hit in the head. So I wound up playing the last few minutes at Wembley in front of like 80,000 plus, the last few minutes of that game. And we won and got the gold medal.
So Becky, this is, first of all, just crazy to hear, and I'm sure crazy to reflect as well. And maybe there's that similarity in that earlier part of your national team experience where you're called on last minute, and not only that, you're able to actually step in and perform well. What do you attribute that to? And whether it's, is it just because it is last minute and you almost don't have time to deal with the nerves and you're just like, you got to do it? Or did you have this like mental composure? Like, where does that come from?
So I've always had kind of like a mantra that it's stay ready so you don't have to get ready. And so, I very much wanted to be a starter. So I was pushing every day and trying to show my absolute best and try to get better and learn from all these people, from the center backs that I was competing with. And so I felt prepared. I was hungry. Like I wanted these opportunities. And so if I got a sliver, if I got a few minutes here or there, I was like, yes, I will do the best that I can in these minutes and like get a real sense of accomplishment from that. But also know like I was prepared. Like I was full in.
Like fully expecting, someone will go down and I'll be the one that they'll call.
Well, hopefully not in an injury sort of way, but you just never know in soccer, whether it's red cards, whether it's injury, sickness, you just never know. So I was just like, I had hope that my moment would come. And then I also knew I needed to be prepared because I do get a lot of confidence from being prepared for things.
So I know you have almost both sides of the coin where on the one hand, it's that substitute role coming in. And on the other hand, where you are today, team captain, starter, really a key player with the national team. I would love for you to take me through that women's national team pressure cooker that comes with being in the system, where it's almost, you never really know, it's never very certain. You're always trying to fight for it. You're always trying to perform. The stress never really subsides in a sense. Walk me through that just so, people on the outside can kind of get a sense of what it means to be on the national team.
Oh yeah, it is a high pressure environment. And that is because you are being evaluated basically every minute of every day. So like every training session, every meeting, every weightlifting session, like you're being watched, you're being scrutinized, and some people can deal with that and some people can't. And so, it's tough getting a look with the national team. It is exceedingly tough to stay with the national team because it can be a very, very tough environment. And I know for me, like getting used to that day-to-day pressure and just kind of just getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And we say that a lot with the national team. And I think Jill Ellis, who was our coach for the 2015 and 2019 Women's World Cup, said it really well that some teams visit pressure, but we live in the pressure. And that's really true because of the sheer quality of player that we have in our pool and just the day in, day out competitiveness. I mean, we're always in that pressure. And so it actually does become where you're like, oh, like I like going into training when I was a younger player, I was like, oh my gosh, my stomach is roiling. Like, oh my God, what if we just hit long balls today? Like, that's my worst thing. Like, am I going to just get completely ripped apart because I can't hit this long ball 75 yards? And now it's kind of like, okay, I've turned this into, we probably will be hitting long balls today, but that's okay. I've been working on it. This is a good challenge. I need to work on it anyway. So just trying to change the perspective of it and really like appreciate that it's uncomfortable and appreciate the competitiveness and to find the fun in all of that. And I think what's great about the women's national team is that we find a lot of fun in the wildness that is our environment.
Because it's so easy to forget that at the end of the day, it's a game. Like you're playing a game and it should be fun. So I think that's so important to implement. And not only that, how do you almost toil with all the different coaches that may come in? Because every coach has a different, strategy and different perspective of, oh, this player is actually the best and should be in that position. How have you gone through that phase where you've had different coaches and some know you better than others from before? How do you almost toil with that?
I see it more as an opportunity because I know under Pia, she was very clear with her roles and who she wanted in, that starting team and the reserve team. And so we had Tom Sermani come in after Pia's time was done. And I saw that as like a new coach. He's going to be evaluating us from ground zero. There's going to be no preconceived ideas of players and playing time and positions. And I thrived under that. And he actually, was starting to change up. He was starting to phase out some of the players and bring in new players. And to me, it was just this wonderful fresh start. Everyone had just a blank canvas and I loved it. And so even when Tom didn't last very long, sadly, he was a wonderful guy, but that's when Jill came in. And even with Jill, I had some prior experience with her as part of the youth teams. She was actually one of the first coaches to cut me from a team. And so I was like, oh no, my career is, kind of over before it started. But even with Jill, even though she, had ideas about me as a player, I was able to change them. I think because, I was in the environment, she got to see me. I'm a little bit more of a slow burn type of player. I'm not someone that really stands out at first, but I think you start appreciating it the longer I'm there. And fortunately, I did well enough to kind of change her mind. So going into that 2015 tournament, I had become one of the starters.
So perfect segue. Let's go to 2015. You become a starter. What did that shift look like for you? And from a confidence perspective, from the mental side of it, how did you take that new role on?
I was just so excited. That was, going into 2015, having a different role than in 2011. And just this is what I had dreamed about. And so I was just soaking every moment in. We were in Canada and, the team, we didn't start off great, but we slowly started cooking near the end of the tournament, wound up winning a fantastic game against Japan. But how I felt playing, we had a strong back line and we were just vibing and it just felt so easy and we were reading off each other and just really enjoying it all. Even if, the games were close, it was just no, we got this. There was such a belief. And for me, I'm never certain about anything, but there was a moment at the World Cup where I saw us playing and I was there's no way anyone's going to beat us. We're winning this thing. And I've never felt that before. And it was awesome.
Wow. And take me through that moment where after the fact you become team captain, right? And that carries a lot of weight with it, captain of the U.S. women's national soccer team. That's incredible. What did that role and that title do for you? And was there any moment of imposter syndrome? I talk about imposter syndrome a lot on this podcast and it comes up a lot in all different industries, right? So I would love to know how you've ever experienced that, if so.
Yeah. So right after 2015, a lot of our veterans like Abby Wambach, Christy Pierce, these kind of household names retired. And so, the leadership position, that's kind of second tier of player was really, this is your team now. You need to start owning it. And so Jill made Carly Lloyd and myself captains of the team and absolutely imposter syndrome. I was what are you doing? Are you sure this is the right decision? I'll do everything in my power to make sure that I am the captain this team should be. But imposter syndrome was running very strong within me. And, there were some issues for a few years after 2016. We obviously didn't do great at that 2016 tournament in Brazil. And, players were getting upset. There was some conflict between the staff and the players. And I was kind of the conduit trying to get us to a place where we could have a good relationship. And I think through that, Jill was look, we're going to move away from you as captain and we're going to actually make these other players captain. So I actually wound up losing the captaincy. And so talk about imposter syndrome. You're just I am an imposter. I just got proven. And so my role changed, but my leadership didn't. I was still asked to do things that were important for the team. I was still being asked to reach out to players and to do certain things. And so going into 2019, I was not the captain anymore. And it wasn't until Vlatko took over that then I was named captain again.
Wow. I didn't actually know that. And so Becky, take me through, like, looking back now on that experience, would you have done anything differently?
Yeah, I definitely would have been more true to myself. I think with getting the captaincy, I, maybe thought I should be doing different things or doing them differently. Because, when you think of a stereotypical captain, it's like super high energy, extrovert, rah, rah. And that's just not me. I'm introverted. I'm more like a pull you to the side and see how you're doing type of person. And with, the things that were going on between the staff and the players, I felt very alone. Like I should be able to do this myself, as opposed to like really reaching out and asking for help from people. And so during that time, I felt very isolated and alone and kind of felt like a failure because I clearly wasn't doing the right things in order to make this relationship better. And so when Vlatko then asked if I wanted to be the captain, I was in such a better place. I had learned from my mistakes from the earlier captaincy, and I was more true to myself. I was so much more willing to ask for help when I needed it. I had a support system and a few players that I could really lean on and ask, be like, hey, I really need your help with this. I really try to empower other leaders to step up, especially those that have like very specific types of leadership. Like, hey, can you give this speech today? I think the players would really respond well to it. And so really trying to like create more leaders. And that's something that I've tried to very much carry through this captaincy is like, I'm not going to be around for very much longer. Like, let's make sure that next tier of players really ready to step in and take over for this team.
Wow. I love that. And Becky, like you said, you're an introvert. True and true, you're an introvert. And among you are often a lot of extroverts, right? Especially when you bring in, sports and athletes and making sure that the energy is there. What have you learned from your own experience as a captain, as an introverted leader amongst different personalities that you have really like taken with you wherever you end up going, right? But this is like fundamental leadership tricks that you've learned from this experience.
I would say that relationship building is very important. I think, I've tried to make an effort to really get to know the players, and maybe that's over a coffee or a trip on the bus and you sit next to them and you're just talking with them and just trying to figure out who they are and what makes them tick, and to show that I care, because I like truly care about these people that play with the national team. And so putting in that effort to build that relationship so that you can fall back on that relationship should something bad be happening, whether there be issues or conflicts. So I think relationship building is important. I also think as an introvert that you observe a bit more, like you get a good pulse of the team and you could read the room. And so for me, that really helps with kind of figuring out, okay, why are these players upset? What is a possible solution that can bring everything back together? And so kind of like a conflict resolution by being able to get the pulse of the team is another thing. And also, like, I've also noticed that, when you're trying to create a game plan or you're trying to figure out what's going wrong on the field, people are just throwing out all these things that could be possible solutions. And I found, as being an introvert and you just kind of watching all these things happen, like you can kind of synthesize the information and try to, whittle it down to something that's easily done. Yeah. And so you can actually be like, okay, it sounds like we need to do this, this, and this. And it's like, oh, okay, we've got our next steps.
Wow. And Becky, you've mentioned that throughout your game, and I talked to actually Steve Swanson before this. He gave some incredible insight, and then also to teammates of yours on the national team and Portland. And one thing that seems so true, they're a couple, but one is you're consistent, always consistent, that they know what they're going to get from you. And Steve said that from, a very young age, from 15 years old, he could tell, okay, this is the Becky that I will get. How do you, that for me is very much just like so strong mentally to come out every single time you step on the field and be consistent. And it seems like just from your own anecdotal stories right now, like you do a lot of self-talk, but what are other aspects to your mental game that give you that consistency each and every time you step on the field?
I think it's just controlling the controllables. Like there's always things that are always in your control, and that is your work ethic, your attitude, your adaptability, your coachability, And so those are in your hands. When you step on the soccer field, you might not be able to pass the ball A to B, but you can still do all these things that are just as important and can make up for a lot. And also for me, like that's on the field, but off the field, being focused and open and present for that time that you're, in the training room, at the stadium, on the field, like you can do that for 3 hours if you need to. You be open, you be focused, you pay attention, you ask people how they're doing, you greet them, and you just like,
I love that.
You try to set off good vibes because you know that that's going to like return and resonate throughout the group. And so if that's in your control, why not bring that every single day?
Yep. Oh, I love that. And one thing more recently, but it's very clear that you're also the type of leader that doesn't bow away from taking a stand on issues that are happening externally, beyond the soccer bubble, whether it's social injustice, racial injustice, equal pay gap, all of that. When did you realize that this is another part of your so-called job description that you need to take on?
I would say probably my first stint with the national team, because they were already in the midst of negotiating their most recent CBA, their most recent collective bargaining agreement.
Yeah.
And so there would be like a team meeting called like players only in one of the players' rooms, one of the captains' rooms. And they'd be like, all right, so just talk to the lawyer. These are the things that we're still negotiating. Here are some bumps in pay that weren't nearly high enough. And so like, I'm just watching these women take control of their own livelihoods and being like, no, we need to push harder on that, push harder on that. And so that's when I was like, oh, like we do have agency and autonomy with how we're being treated. And it's a tough fight and we get told no a lot, but like we got to keep going for it. And so that was when I first realized like I don't just have to be an observer of my life. I actually can like step in and actually make a change if I think that something's wrong.
And has that been challenging, right? Because those are things that you don't necessarily get taught of how to communicate that externally, for instance. Is that something that's always been a part of you ever since, even you were in high school, you were fighting these fights that were separate from yourself even?
Yeah, I would say that I would notice these inequities and be like, why is that? That is not okay. Yeah. And then also having that little voice in your head being like, well, that's the way it's always been. And like, you don't deserve this. And you should just be grateful for what you have. And being like, what is that voice? Like, where did that voice come from? And so I knew things were wrong, but I didn't have the terminology. I didn't have the knowledge, the background of like why these things have come to be. And so it really wasn't until the national team before I almost like realized I was brainwashed and needed to be deprogrammed and then build myself back up surrounded by these like wonderful women.
Coming now to 2023, the World Cup just happened. You obviously had to miss it for injury. Take me through that experience where you realized that, this is actually not going to be in my future, or this is not a reality and I won't be able to go to the World Cup. What did that do to you?
Oh, it was like heartbreaking. It was just like, no, not this. This was my last go. And I really thought like I can do something good. Like I still can bring something impactful for this group. And even when I realized physically that I wasn't going to be able to contribute, I was like, well, maybe my leadership, maybe they'll bring me in as someone that could be kind of this like vibes, cohesive, steady presence. And just the way that the roster got created, there just wasn't space for a player that wasn't going to be able to contribute minutes. And so it was just, heartbreaking, and then I was kind of dreading the start of the tournament. Like, will I be able to watch and can my heart handle it? And I very, very quickly turned into just like a super fan. And, I was in constant communication with players. They were texting me. I was texting them. And so I still felt involved, which like, I love them for that. But still, it's tough. I lost my dad earlier this year. So it's just like, man, this is the worst year ever. And so, it was tough.
Yeah. First of all, I am so sorry for your loss. And speaking of, whether it was the right decision that they didn't take you even for that leadership position, like you said, we'll never know. But when you look back at their performance, what do you think was missing? Like, how do you kind of conceptualize their, coming out of the tournament so fast and obviously, given the US standards, not doing well?
Yeah, it's tough because if I look back at all of the World Cups I've been a part of, us making it to the next round or winning the actual World Cup comes down to a PK or a post, like these very fine margins.
Right.
And so for the last few, the ball's bounced our way, whether it be luck or whatever. Like, we've always gotten the benefit of the bounce. And it just seemed like this tournament, we didn't have the benefit of the bounce. I also will contribute that too. It didn't seem like, I'll go back to brave and assertive. I feel like the players were isolated and we were expecting players to just do individual brilliance to either break pressure or to create chances or to get goals. And I think at that level, you're just competing against teams, not just individuals, but really cohesive teams that can defend and cover one another. So you're never going one against one. You're going one against three. And, it's very hard to beat three players on one run. And so I just felt like it seemed isolated on the field, which really hurts my heart.
And obviously, every player is trying their absolute best in every role that they have. But when you think of that, and I agree, right? I could see that individualistic rather than that team effort. Do you attribute that to leadership, to the coach, to players, to mentality? How do you, if anything?
I think that's tough. And I wish, if I were in the environment, I would have a better gauge of what that could really be, whether it's formation or, like you said, preparation. Is it the game plan? Is it the stress of the environment? It's probably a compilation of a lot of those things.
Right.
And unfortunately, it's not me to pinpoint that just because I didn't live it and I'd only be speculating.
Yeah. So Becky, you kind of mentioned, that it may be the last run at a World Cup. I, in my mind, probably refuse to believe that, to be totally honest. But I'd love to know, how are you thinking of, the next few years and your life post, women's national team experience and this huge, incredible run that you've had? How do you think of the future?
I think missing the World Cup made me realize that even if I'm not playing soccer, my life is not done. I very quickly became a super fan, which I'm like, okay, I will always be a fan of this program. I love this program. And I love soccer. And so I do want to keep playing. I do think I've got a little bit left in me. But I've started maybe I should get my coaching certificates. And so the NWSL is great. They actually host B and C courses for coaching. And so maybe I'll start chiseling away at that. And I think giving back to the game is something that I really want to do because it's given me so much. So if that's coaching, if that's, front office, GM, maybe even commentary, I just love the game too much to get away from it. And so I'll for sure still stay very involved with the sport.
I love that. And I think you would be so excellent at literally any of those roles. So that's super exciting.
Thanks.
So Becky, as a final fun questions, I want to know, so it seems that you're an avid reader. You have a Kindle. I talked to Naomi Girma. You guys both love Kindles. And so tell me, what is a book that you've read that you think everyone has to read?
Everyone has to read. Ooh, okay. That's.
I love the way you just light up.
I know. I'm
question.
Looking at all the books that I have in my. Okay. I'm a very big fan of his dark materials. So the first book, The Golden Compass, I think I'm a huge fantasy sci-fi person. And that is such an amazing book that just opens this world and you get so attached to the characters. And I think that's such a great opener to the world and to the genre that I would suggest that trilogy.
Ooh, okay. I'll take a look.
Yep. Philip Pullman.
What is a craft that you are almost spending your lifetime honing?
Does trying not to feel like an imposter, is that a craft? Does that work?
I think so.
Okay, because I am just so sick of myself feeling like that, feeling like an imposter. Even to this day on the field, I'm like, why am I out here? And I'm just like, Becky, you know why you're out here. You've got 20 years of experience. So if I'm thinking that, just thinking about other women in the workplace, in their workplaces being like, should I get this promotion or should I ask for that raise? Like, yeah, you should.
Wow. So true. And I love that. And that is just shocking to me that you are asking yourself this. But again, that's the thing about imposter syndrome. Like from the outside, it's so clear as day that you deserve it and you're supposed to be there. And yet, you know, your inner demons are telling you otherwise, which is so fascinating. But anyway, so last question. What would you say is your superpower as a human, not player, but as a person?
I do consider myself very compassionate. I do feel a lot for people and, you know, empathy, sympathy. Like I very easily give my heart to people, even though it doesn't really quite seem like that because my introverted self does it in weird ways that people sometimes don't recognize it. But I do care a lot about people and what they're going through and just trying to, like, if they've got goals, help them along their way. And so I would probably say that.
I love it. All right, Becky, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for having me. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much for listening to the show this week. If you enjoyed, please spread the word. Tell someone about She Leads or post about it on social media and tag us. If you want to contact us, feel free to send over a message through the She Leads Instagram page at sheleads.show. If you want to follow us on Twitter, our account is at SheLeadsShow, and mine is at Carly Malatsky. This episode was produced and edited by Nick Verschow. Thank you also to our partner, Floodgate. If you're passionate about startups and want to learn more about the starting journey of those who have built groundbreaking companies, I highly recommend listening to Starting Greatness with Mike Maples Jr., the founding partner of Floodgate. He has an incredible show that, in my opinion, is definitely worth your time. Thanks again.